All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are here with Katie Gilbert for our workshop. And Katie comes to us from Philadelphia. Katie, I'm actually going to ask you to go ahead and give your introduction. And I am going to be working on the background here on something. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sure, no problem. Hi, everybody. It really is so good to be with you all here today talking about thought leadership. Uh, Something that I realized I've been thinking about for a long time, actually, as a writer working with clients, often universities, often focused in the climate space, who want to project their own thought leadership. And a lot of my work with them has been helping to translate technical research into more accessible article articles, event summaries, white papers. And so I've come to think of a lot about this idea of translation and how important that is to thought leadership to the climate space. I'm also a freelance journalist. I teach a first year required writing class at a visual arts school where I also think a lot about the art of translation. So it's really within the last year or so that I've been thinking really concertedly about thought leadership for climate leaders, individual climate leaders, and how where we get stuck and how important it is that this group of people, climate leaders of all stripes, better understand what's so important about thought leadership, what's getting in their way, and what tools and frameworks they can use to get started in creating an individually tailored thought leadership practice. So that's what I want to talk to you all about today. Steph, should I go ahead and get started with the presentation? Okay, great. So here we are, thought leadership for humans. As I was saying, it's really been over the past year that I've been talking with a lot of climate leaders one-on-one about thought leadership and about how they think about thought leadership. And in these conversations, I notice this recurring, really interesting paradox that tends to come up. Many of us, I can relate to this too, have this sense that we ought to be talking more publicly about our work or about the work we want to do or about the causes we care about. But then on the other hand, when we think about becoming a thought leader, something feels kind of fundamentally gross about that for many of us. And I think that tension, that common tension is really interesting. I think whenever we find in ourselves a contradiction that's being held with these tension points, it's worth diving into, it's worth unpacking. Because if we put the aversion for aside for a moment, what this suggests is that some part of us believes that a thought leadership practice could be really powerful. And I think that part of us is right. But we still have this aversion, right? And we don't want to just work around the aversion or white knuckle it or pretend that isn't there. So that's worth dealing with. And here's what I want to suggest to you about where this aversion is coming from and why it's maybe not completely worth listening to. What I love about thought leadership is it's such a varied, such a beautifully wily mix of all kinds of different content and conversation and approaches. But what's become really tempting is to narrow down this really varied landscape into the worst possible version. And we all know what this worst possible version looks like. I think we could probably largely agree on what it looks like and maybe where we tend to find it. It's the endless self-promotion. It's shrieking, especially online, to be the loudest voice in the room at any cost. It appeals to shock value and emotional manipulation. Of course, this is all out there, but this doesn't have to represent everything that thought leadership could be or should be. And we know where we can go to find some of the not great examples of thought leadership, but for some laughs and satire, I do recommend the Instagram Best of LinkedIn. At least I really hope this post is satire. I don't know for sure. But I want to suggest to you that not all thought leadership is necessarily represented by even this parody post here. It goes way beyond that. And that's what I really want to start to explore today with a lot of specific examples. A metaphor I like to come to in talking about how varied thought leadership could be, think about economics. So many different models and ways of interacting among each other within the field of economics. Some good, some bad, and maybe the bad tend to get too many focus to the expense of not breathing life into the good examples of economic arrangements. And I think one writer who puts this really well is Marjorie Kelly in this wonderful book, Owning Our Future. Marjorie Kelly talks about generative economics as opposed to extractive economies and economics. Again, we all know examples of the extractive version, right? Businesses, financial models, companies that prioritize the maximum physical and financial extraction, again, at any cost. But we don't want to forget that there are generative economic models as well. Economies whose fundamental architecture tends to create beneficial rather than harmful outcomes. In other words, arrangements that encourage all life, conditions for all life to thrive, human and non-human. And in the book, Marjorie Kelly gives deep examples of cooperative economics, community credit institutions, green banks. The examples are there if we're willing to look for them and not assume that they're all extractive. I want to apply a similar framework and breakdown to thought leadership. What if there could be such a thing, and in fact, there is such a thing, and maybe we've all even encountered such a thing as generative thought leadership? Thought leadership designed to bring about beneficial outcomes for many. So it's not just about you anymore. And again, I think we do all have examples of this in our life. This After all, thought leadership doesn't just live on LinkedIn. I think that's one way we can flatten it. There are people doing really good stuff on LinkedIn. I'm a big fan of LinkedIn. We'll talk about it a little bit later, although I don't think thought leadership should or can stop there. Thought leadership is also podcasts. It's also Instagram reels, YouTube reels. It's also email newsletters. It's also that op-ed or that essay or that book that inspired your career path. It's also, and I think this is really important to say, in-person events organized around discussing a certain topic. My broad definition, and again, I keep it very broad, of thought leadership is the consistent production and sharing of insights meant to, over the long term, influence a certain outcome or change. Again, very broad potential negative uses of that and potential positives, like trying to get a job, trying to find customers for your product or services, trying to attract investment for your project or company, getting people to sign a petition, encouraging people to contact their local elected officials. These, or, a long-term goal, I don't know, bringing about the clean energy transition. These could all be the outcomes we're going for with thought leadership, and generative thought leadership is helping to push those positive outcomes into being. Of course, extractive thought leadership is more focused on the one, the individual, the self-promotion. It's all about the maximum extraction of attention, emotion, and or money to benefit just one or a few. I want to pause here and mention that you all, with your affiliation with work on climate, have probably already started to think about leadership in this slightly different way. I was so struck by this essay, this email newsletter that came out toward the end of last year announcing this shift in the goals that work on climate is arrayed around, where it used to be largely about encouraging climate passionate people to move into working in jobs in climate. The goal is now much bigger, much more ambitious, much more transformative, encouraging us individually and collectively to work toward the regenerative economy. Very similar definition to Marjorie Kelly's term, slightly different word, but same idea. And I especially loved this passage in that newsletter about leadership, why leadership matters more than jobs. And I'm just going to read this last paragraph here. We cannot change existing systems simply by competing for jobs produced by those very systems. You don't create that kind of change by doing exactly what you're paid to do. You create it through leadership, through becoming an agent of change. And I would submit to you that one way to start to step into that leadership right where you are is by experimenting with a thought leadership practice. All of you can start doing that without any additional credentials or bona fides, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment as well. So this is our goal today, to really break down what may have been a flat definition or idea of thought leadership and think about what generative thought leadership could look like for you, individually tailored to you, your skills, your place in the world, your position and your experience, and your ambitions, the movements that you want to be part of. Another benefit of this, that's a pretty major one, is that once you connect to the generative form of thought leadership, this is going to be a lot more motivating for you in keeping the practice going. Because again, this isn't something we need a white knuckle. This is something that can become about a responsibility to something larger than yourself, which in itself becomes a motivator to keep it going. Because yes, it is hard work. It can be uncomfortable in many ways, but if it feels worth it to you, you're more likely to do it. And why do it? Honestly, there could be a whole presentation on that, and I could give you a lot of examples of what I've seen people start to get out of this, often much to their surprise. But many of the reasons collected into four broad categories here. As you start to share your insights more regularly in whatever format or platform you choose to do that in, you're starting to build trust, familiarity with yourself and your personality, your ideas, and you're starting to develop some warm leads for possible project collaborators, event co-hosts, or the types of customers that your sustainable business is pulling in. You're also attracting inbound opportunities, the types of opportunities that you can't necessarily solicit the other way by going out and making requests. This might be, for example, media opportunities, invitations to speak on a podcast about that thing you've been writing or speaking about publicly for months now. Of course, it could be job opportunities. Third, we're talking about starting to create this really interesting thought loop and circuit in your own brain where you're sharpening your thinking about your ideas. When you put them out in the world, if people are generous, and they often are, they're offering you some feedback, some pushback, some really good questions, and that's pushing you to improve the way you talk about your climate solutions, the movements that you want to build. This part can be really underestimated, but is often kind of a surprise benefit for some of the people I've seen get going in their thought leadership practice. Fourth, and I would guess most importantly for a lot of the people in this room, by pushing yourself to start a thought leadership practice and figure out how it works best for you, you're advocating for the work you care about. You're creating more oxygen for the climate solutions that need to find their way into our future. So I would suggest that one of the best ways To move from distaste to starting to tinker with what your own thought leadership practice could look like, starting to move from overwhelm of thought leadership is this nebulous thing, what are even the first steps to take to get there, to I'm going to take some steps to get there. The a really helpful way to break this down is to find a role for yourself as a thought leader. And so I've come up with these 6 archetypes of climate thought leaders. This is certainly not comprehensive and just something to noodle on. There's a lot of opportunities here for hybridized versions. I know some storyteller translators, for example, so certainly don't feel limited by these. But I have found that it's helpful sometimes for people to identify with one of these types of climate thought leaders. And then from there, it becomes a little clearer what your next steps might be to getting the ball rolling. Also, as I go through these 6 types, and I'm going to share examples for each, you'll just start to see how incredibly varied thought leaders are, their contributions are, and hopefully that helps you see yourself among this array. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about each archetype, share examples of each, and then I'm going to come back to this slide and pause and just ask everyone to drop in the chat which of these types you're aligning with, if any, or maybe it's a hybridized version, and we can start to see how varied the room is, I would guess, in terms of what types of thought leadership you'd like to start making. So the visionary. The visionary is someone who's talking to us about the future and importantly, how to get there. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to talk about core drives and typical types of content to move through these, but I'll be sharing the full slide deck with everybody after the fact. Typical content for the visionary often takes the form of manifestos. In other words, writing essays or longer form content about this is what I believe the future should look like, and that's why. It might be just about a specific industry. This is where a specific industry must go next, or the future of X. Maybe it's speaking at length in a keynote or a podcast to synthesize some big ideas across various domains to paint this picture of the future. Now, as you'll see, again, with many of these archetypes, we have a really broad range here of forms these can take. I will say that I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I tend to find that visionaries work in slightly longer form writing. They just need more words to talk about or write about their visions for the climate future. But even within that long form category, there's a lot of variation here, right? Tessa Peerless was a member of the community Climate Drift with me. She is Canadian and she has a Canadian startup that's setting out to electrify all residences in Canada. And she has a Substack that she just started last year, where once a week she's looking to the future. For example, Canada's future is electric, and that's a good thing. And she's making that case in her Substack and then dribbling little parts of that into LinkedIn. And she was really nervous about getting started with this, but this has been a really powerful practice for her. Local to me and a print example, print and online, we have Nick Esposito, who was the director of Circular Philadelphia for a long time. He has written several local op-eds and longer essays for this magazine in Philly called Grid, which is print and it's given out all over the city and online. And what he tends to write about is how public policy needs to change in this city. So often visionaries are looking at policy. I mean, not always, but that can be a focus. And then here we have 2 books. I highly recommend this one of my favorites in the last couple years, called What If We Get It Right by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's a marine biologist and a writer and has a nonprofit. Subtitle, Visions of Climate Futures. And that's exactly what it is. It's a collection of essays and interviews and art looking ahead to a very hopeful climate future and asking the question, what do we need to do to get there? I'm guessing some or many of you are familiar with Paul Hawken and the Drawdown Project, which is doing something similar to Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, but in a more data-focused way, looking at the data and the numbers behind how we need to get from here to there in terms of our climate future. Archetype number two is the translator. The translator often has access to an understanding of highly technical information. Maybe it's climate science, maybe it's policy, maybe it's, for many people, that especially intimidating area of finance, hugely important for the climate transition, into clear, actionable narratives that non-experts can use. And one thing that's interesting to think about is maybe you're talking to non-experts writ large, members of the public, or maybe you're talking to people who are experts in a different domain, but not experts in yours, and bridging a gap that needs to be bridged. So the translator is often doing that work of connecting, which overlaps a little bit with the connector type, but translation is required there. Typical content might be really clear, boiled down explainers or boiled down briefings about important events or news, decision guides to help understand how to connect technical, hard to understand data to actions that need to be taken. So that's what we're really focusing on here. Three examples of translators. Daniel Pauly is a European scientist who focuses on fish and fisheries, and he's had a huge influence just in the academic sphere, but one of his huge focuses is also making sure to bring his findings to the public. And so with Sea Around Us, he and his team have created these databases that the public can look into and interact with. Over on Instagram, by contrast, is Dr. Catherine Heo, who's at Texas Tech. And as a climate scientist, wants to be educating the public about the technical climate science that can feel too intimidating to them to understand. And she has this beautiful skill that a lot of translators have, which is constructing a compelling metaphor. You have a good example of that here. Climate change is the hole in the bucket of every other issue we want to fix. And then over on YouTube, so yet another platform, is Dr. Daniel Swain, who is also, he's an atmospheric scientist and has started this interesting thing in the past year where he goes over on YouTube once a week and has open office hours where members of the public can come and ask questions, and he explains about changes happening in California and the Western US. The connector is really interesting because they're potentially connecting people who need to be talking to each other. Sometimes they're connecting sectors that need to be talking to each other or larger disciplines, ideas. So they're kind of doing this work of hybridizing two disciplines that might seem too different to be talked about in the same essay, for example, but they're finding ways to connect them. So there are a few different levels on which the connectors could be working. Something like a climate change movement, whether it's broad-based or working on a smaller issue, really needs coalitions, right? So the connector is so important. They're often these coalition builders. Typical content might be case studies to show how cross-sector or cross-discipline projects could work to show people that that's possible, inspire similar action. It might mean organizing interviews and panels, maybe online or maybe IRL, to get people literally talking to each other who need to be talking to one another. Or it could be convening smaller events or maybe large ones where you're bringing people into the same room around a common discussion point and letting people bump into each other and having those conversations in a more organic way. It was still very important work. Or on social media, this can happen within who should know whom posts, where the format is you're saying so and so should really speak to so and so about this such and such a topic. This is my take. Am I right? I'd love to hear both of your takes. And then that way you're starting to build out an interconnected network, build some connections that may not have existed yet. I can't mention connectors without mentioning Marco Marowek, who is one of the founders of Climate Drift, which I'm also a member of, as I mentioned. And one thing that Climate Drift does, similar to work on climate, is bring people together to trade resources and support as they're making that transition into working on climate, right? So, in that sense, it's a connector. But also, I did their career accelerator. And what that was really designed to do was not only create this community, which was very important, but introduce each of us within that accelerator to disciplines we might not have interacted with yet. So each week focused on a different aspect of the energy transition. And for me, it was really connecting the work I've done so far in my life to these new disciplines and thinking about possible, ways to spider web things together. And so I see Marco and his co-founder Skander as connectors on various levels. When talking about connecting different disciplines, I would point to someone else I met in Climate Drift named Nate Barula, who started this newsletter called The Climate Code, where he's bringing AI into conversation with in talking about environmental challenges and possible solutions and saying these two areas need to be in conversation and talking about the ways that's already happening and pointing out ways it needs to happen. One shameless example here of something I put together in Philadelphia, it's been really important to me to explore what in-person thought leadership can look like. So I gave this a try last fall and basically invited members of Philadelphia's Sustainable Business Network so that sustainability focused business owners in this city could talk to one another about how they could be speaking up more publicly about the changes they want to see here locally. And that was really interesting to see just how being in that room together, how hosting them was so valuable in starting conversations. The storyteller is making the climate crisis and importantly, climate solutions real, right? Makes them real, human, understandable on the just on the ground level. I would say often this content is profiles or case studies. So whether these profiles are written or told via visual storytelling, we're talking about profiles of workers or residents or customers who have maybe experienced some sort of climate solution or intervention. And the stories can show a before and after narrative or transformation. Or it could be a day in the life case studies to offer windows into specific projects. You'll see here and in some of the other archetypes I'm talking about, I'm often offering a format that the content can take repeatedly. And I don't want you to shy away from that because in starting a sustainable thought leadership practice, it's so helpful to make life easier for your future self. Reach for a format that works for you and then be willing to tweak it week by week or month by month so that you're not starting from scratch every time. Our goal is to make this practice sustainable and fun for you and not to invite burnout. So that's why I'm suggesting formats that I think work and can be repurposed. Again, examples of storytellers that really span the spectrum. On one side here, we have a public performance that was organized in cities across the world by a writer and artist, Eve Mosher, called High Waterline. It would start with the drawing of a line around certain parts of a neighborhood or city with chalk to indicate where climate change was making future flooding and storm surges more likely. And then attendees were invited into participatory storytelling around this line. In a far different type of example, I have a more corporate example here from a company called Watershed, which makes software that helps companies track their emissions. They make really good case studies that aren't just heavy on the insight, but really layer that insight into narrative storytelling to help understand the human perspective on some of the projects that they're sharing about. Now, the final two archetypes are the old code breaker, and then the next one is the new code maker. And these are obviously related in some ways, but the old code breaker is focused more on old, stale narratives, broken stories that just need to go, pointing those out, and hopefully offering better alternatives. One key here is to resist resorting to outrage about some of the stories that need to change and focusing on what's possible if we get those out of the way. Typical content, another recurring format you could reach for here would be myths versus realities. Again, this is something you could do every week and tweak it each time. A different form of critiquing common approaches or accounts of people who are specifically working to replace old systems with better ones. And on this next slide, I have an example of someone doing that, replacing an old system with a better one. Manuela here has co-founded, and she's the CEO of a startup called Kadea, which is reducing plastic bottle waste with these vending machines they've designed that dispense water in a stainless steel bottle, and then they can take the stainless steel bottle back, clean it, refill it to repeat the process again. It's a closed loop bottling system. And in the podcast they launched last year, it's really interesting to listen to Manuela talk about what she wants to do in the podcast. There's a YouTube video introducing the podcast and talking about how she's thinking about it. And really, of course, they're talking about what Kadea is doing, but they're also looking at what the incumbent bottle industry is so resistant to changing and what needs to be changed. So this is an example of someone who's taking on a huge incumbent with a better solution and making a case for why that substitution needs to happen. And then again, a very different example here. Last year, Patagonia's corporate sustainability report made some waves because they included this line, "Nothing we do is sustainable," and made the case that through this example, made the case that corporate sustainability reports are often filled with a lot of greenwashing and empty promises, and they're doing this a slightly different way. And of course, advertising themselves is more authentic by making a sustainability report that's more transparent about how they're failing, doing it a different way. And finally, we have the new code maker. So this is someone who wants to talk more about how to codify lessons they've gotten on the job or on the day-to-day into repeatable playbooks that others can use. So these playbooks can travel into other people's lives, other people's work to accelerate impact. So this often takes the shape of step-by-step guides, specific templates to follow, even checklists, or just here's exactly how we did it, breakdowns of projects or deals. These need to go deep to work. I think sometimes a failing of these is they stay a little on the surface, but if you've really got the experience to back it up, this can be a really, really useful contribution. two examples here. Coming back to climate drift. Skander runs the Substack over there, and this is often something he does. He really likes to plot out step-by-step guides to help people do what other people have already figured out. This is an example he did in partnership with Fabian Kuchekian after they did a live fireside chat, how to actually raise your round if you're a climate startup. And it's a long post with step by step, dispelling some myths, but a really helpful step by step guide. This is a newsletter by a European consultant who focuses on circular economy and a step-by-step guide on a very, very different topic, how I helped Prague go circular. So I just threw a lot at you, moved through that pretty quickly. And again, I'm going to share all of this after the fact, along with a few additional slides about next steps you may want to take. I want to pause here and not quite go into the breakout room stuff. Just so you know, I just wanted to see if people could drop in the chat which of these archetypes they're resonating with, so we could see the range. Or maybe there's a concentration. I'm curious.
That's a great idea. Thanks, everybody. Go ahead and pop in the chat. Which archetype do you think you are? And Katie, while they're doing that, we have also a question from
Oh
Grace.
yeah. Sorry I missed that.
And it's okay, you were busy. Grace asked, what's the difference between old code breaker and visionary? How do those two differ?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that the old code breaker, I mean, there's certainly going to be a lot of overlap there. An old code breaker is often someone who's more focused on pointing out the problems in our status quo and maybe making a case for some of these being problems. Um, I think like Manuela obviously needs to be a visionary to think about what the bottling industry needs to be moving toward. But she's also, especially in this podcast, talking a lot about the problems created by the bottling industry so far. And I saw Mara said in the chat, she's an epic source, worth following her. Highly agreed. Follow her on LinkedIn as well, because what she's been talking a lot about lately is plastic waste. And again, everyone in this room knows that plastic waste is a problem, but to see some of her visualizations about how high the tower of bottles would reach that are thrown away every day if we stacked them on top of each other, or learn more about effects on marine life. She's really focusing on the problems with the status quo. And I would say a visionary is looking more toward systems that don't exist yet. Like in that book, um, the Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson book, The Visions of Climate Futures is the subtitle. And oh yeah, what if we get it right? Often the people she's talking to are, for example, describing finance structures that don't exist yet and should. So I'll leave it there for now, but I think there are some important differences between the two.
Thanks, Katie. We're seeing a lot of responses in the chat. I'm not sure if you're able to see those, but we've got
Yeah,
we've
okay,
got a
great.
lot of we've got a lot of new code breakers. We've got a lot of storytellers.
Great. Yeah, I see some good hybrids too.
Hmm.
And one way I like to think about it as well, maybe you're resonating with one of these types or two of these types, and you're saying, I could get started on that today, being I saw a visionary storyteller in there. And sometimes I like to have a stretch type in mind. Maybe I want to grow toward also including some new code makers in there to have some templates that help people as well. So again, I'm going to share these slides after the fact, and it's there that deck will include some additional slides that I just didn't have time to get into today. Next steps for each archetype. So those are text-heavy slides. You'll have some hopefully important info, helpful info there. But next steps for everybody, no matter who you are, which type you are. It's really, really helpful to define a narrow niche. I promise this helps you go deeper. This gives you more ideas, not fewer. And I think marketers know how important it is to focus on audience, but I've noticed that the solo thought leaders I talk to often skip this step. So try completing this sentence as you get started. We're not going to have time to do this quite yet today, but we will have time to brainstorm in just a moment on something related. I help blank specific audience solve this specific problem using this specific lens or solution. How would you complete that? That's helping you niche down. Second, you start to pick your platforms. I like to talk about the LinkedIn plus in rule. If you're not showing up on LinkedIn yet, just start there. That's a really powerful way to get started, and I think you might be surprised by who starts to come out of the woodwork. If you've got LinkedIn down, don't stop there. There's Try to choose one more platform. Maybe you're starting an email newsletter, maybe you're pitching op-eds and starting to think about a book you want to write. Maybe it's an in-person event. I like to kind of issue this provocation to not see it just confined to LinkedIn. Finally, come up with a cadence that your brain won't argue with you about. Maybe it's one short post on LinkedIn per week to get started. Now, to get started, we're not just setting goals, we're designing experiments. We're encouraging growth to happen, learning all along the way, and we're lowering the stakes because there's really no way to fail at this. Even if you get started and something's not working, you've learned and you can iterate on that experiment next time. I highly recommend this book, Tiny Experiments by neuroscientist Anne-Laure Lecomte. It's become very important in many parts of my life. It's helped me cut through a lot of my perfectionist tendencies, and I've seen it help do the same for others. So this is what I want to encourage you to think about now. And we're going to take a couple of minutes silently to start to think through these three elements of a tiny experiment, and then you'll have some time in a breakout room to talk through it. On Laura Lecomte in this book talks about how setting a goal can feel like climbing up a ladder, a fixed ladder towards some predetermined end. Let's not assume that we know exactly where we need to go or how we're going to get there. We're going to start moving into iterative growth loops that might take us somewhere interesting and unexpected. That's what tiny experiments can help do, especially with your thought leadership practice if you're feeling overwhelmed and intimidated. So she offers a framework in the book, but it's really a very light touch. You're starting with these three elements. First, a research question. What's a quandary you'd like to put to the test? I wonder how I could get more subscribers for my newsletter. I wonder how I could attract the attention of this public official to have them vote the right way on an ordinance that's coming up soon. Second, hypothesis. You're answering the question with your best guess, reminding yourself that there is not one perfect answer. You're not trying to find the right answer. You're suggesting one possible answer that you would like to learn something about. Unlore says, don't overthink it. This is an intuitive process based on your past experiences and present inclinations. You can design another experiment for the next one. So maybe your hypothesis would be, I could attract more subscribers by having cross-posting opportunities with other newsletters I admire. Or maybe I could organize a teach-in to help more people in my town understand this ordinance that's coming up. And then your pact is basically the experiment you're going to run. Again, keep it simple. I will take a specific action for a specific duration. I will reach out to 3 newsletters I admire per week for the next month, asking about cross-posting opportunities. I will reach out to 1 bookstore per week for the next month to ask if I could host a teach-in there. So you see how you can start to take steps to a really specific set of actions. So I think now's the time we're going to have a couple minutes to think on this, right, Steph?
Yeah, but before we do that, Katie, we've got just a couple questions that have come in
Yeah,
through the chat. Let's
great.
just touch base on those. A couple of people have asked, what if they don't have a niche? Could you give an example? That kind of advice was, they were wrestling with that a little bit.
Right. So when I was saying, I'll go back to that slide. Right. So define your narrow niche. I help blank specific audience solve specific problem. I think this one way to think about this is framed so that it sounds like you already have a work niche or a body of work or a set of expertise. But again, what if you're thinking about this as a role you play in your community or a role you're playing within your family to help educate people about issues that they don't know as much about? What have you read a lot about that you would like people to better understand? Is there an opportunity to organize a study group? I mean, you could be the leader in that sense, where your niche is, for example, you really like to read, you've learned about the climate and been inspired in that way. So you're going to help the people in your life learn and be inspired the way that you have. I think it really all comes down to not necessarily niche as a set of very intellectual expertise, but the specific ways you want to work in the world and the connections that you already have to your friends, to that person in high school who founded a business, whatever it may be, to start to lead to the outcomes that you're interested in. It's about the actions you want to take in the world.
That's really helpful. Thank you. All right. I think we're ready now for the next step.
Okay, great. So we're spending a couple minutes here jotting notes down, and then I think Nicolette and Steph will break everybody into breakout rooms after 2 minutes.
All right, everybody, we're at about 2 minutes. So, Katie, our next steps. We are going to move into breakout rooms and we're going to have a chance to connect with each other. We're going to try to get you into breakout rooms where you're connecting with people who are close or close-ish to you. So if you haven't put in where you are yet, please put in chat exactly where you're calling in from. Um, Katie, did you want to add something?
Sure, yeah, and sorry about the pause there. I was
No worries.
Unmuting. Yeah, I think we'll have about 8 minutes in the breakout rooms, and the idea is for each person to have about 2 minutes to share and brainstorm aloud, if helpful, about their research question and their hypothesis. And if they've gotten there, they're packed. But I would recommend starting with those first two elements.
Sounds good. Okay. Um, Nicolette is going to be pulling us into small groups. If you are not in a small group, automatically, if you're not directly taken away into a small group, then go ahead and put in the chat where you're at, and we're going to try to assign you to another one. Maurice, we've got the research question in the chat for you. It's a quandary you'd like to put to the test. So,
Yes, yeah, exactly. So again, pretty open-ended, but when you think about the larger ambitions you want to move toward, the change you want to influence, how do you start? What's one question you have about how you might get there?
okay. Go ahead and start the rooms anytime now.
Learning. And so she actually does have thought leadership to share along her path, even if she's not expert status.
Yes, what a great point. And honestly, one I really relate to as well as I confront my own fears about speaking up publicly and even teaching a workshop like this. What I try to remind myself is if I'm either one or two steps ahead of the people I'm trying to help, that might be helpful for them. I don't have to be the comprehensive expert in all things, thought leadership or marketing or writing to potentially be helpful. And I hope others are thinking that way as well. It's just another form that pesky perfectionism can take, right? Yes, I agree, Grace. Even more helpful because you can relate more. It's helpful to see people who are recently where you are, and you can translate better. Exactly. You speak the language of someone who hasn't gobbled up all the expertise yet. Yes, because experts can be intimidating. Agreed. We don't always see ourselves in them or in the transformations we want to make. Yeah, thanks, Alyssa, and thanks, Maura. Any other questions from anything we've covered, or we can move along as well? Right. So we're actually going to move into those breakout rooms again because we thought it might be really helpful if you had some concerted time in a breakout room to talk about accountability, how we can support each other in doing this hard thing that, I'll be real, that can be uncomfortable sometimes. Sometimes we need to bring that discomfort along, and it's so much easier if we know there are other people doing the same thing, commiserating, taking a look at what we're about to publish and doing a gut check. So as we send you back into these breakout rooms for about 10 minutes, Steph, correct me if I'm wrong with the timing. What we'd
No, you're
ask you to, that's right. Okay, great. So 10 minutes, maybe for each person to talk about or offer what would be helpful for them in keeping up their momentum or starting the momentum as they get a thought leadership practice going, and maybe what they'd be willing to offer. Some ideas might be accountability partner check-ins via email. How's it been going? What have you run into? Maybe if you're trying to show up on LinkedIn, for example, maybe you connect with people in the group there and you like each other's posts, you comment on each other's posts to, start getting some of those metrics that can help the algorithm show it to other people. Maybe you're willing to take a look at other people's drafts, offer suggestions, do a gut check. This is looking great. You might be scared, but this is ready to share. A lot of different forms this can take, and I'm sure you'll think of even more. So, Nicolette put it in the chat here. What would be helpful for you to start or keep the momentum, and what can you offer as an accountability partner? Does anyone have any questions about that before you head back into your breakout rooms? See how you can support one another?
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for continuing to join us. Welcome back, everyone. All right. Just wait for the last few people to join us from the breakout rooms. Continue on here. So, hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope that went well with you. We've got some next steps and some resources for you if you want to continue to maintain some momentum. First of all, I wanted to let you know that you can stay in touch with the people that you met today. There's several different ways you can do this. You could connect with them on LinkedIn. You may have already mentioned other social platforms where you're already building your thought leadership. And we will have a special place where you can connect on the Work on Climate Slack channel. Nicolette is going to put the link to that channel here. It's the Role Content Creators channel. So you can post your tiny experiments there. You can connect with each other there. And Katie's also going to join us in that channel. Katie, I'm going to let you tell a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so any follow-up questions you have for me as we come away from the workshop today, any feedback you'd like from me, or if you'd like me to be a sounding board on your tiny experiment or a thought leadership idea you have, or you want to show me a short emerging draft, I will be checking in on that channel within Work on Climate every day for the next week. So tag me and you'll get my attention and I'll send you some thoughts and feedback.
That's so generous of you, Katie. I think it's so great. And you've also got in here, you could meet in real life, maybe.
You're
That
right.
would be also fantastic. If you met people who were near you, consider that as an option too.
Yeah, always the in-person thought leadership and relationships, yeah, open up whole new opportunities. I also,
Absolutely.
is it okay, Steph, to move on to
Totally.
this part?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to be sure you all knew that this discussion about thought leadership for humans, how climate leaders can take steps to address their mindset blocks, close some skills gaps and knowledge gaps about how to get started on their own tailor-made thought leadership practices. This is something I'm thinking a lot about and now running a recurring 6-week program to think about. We're starting cohort 2 on May 18th. This is hosted within the Climate Drift community. It's like a private community within Climate Drift, and anyone who joins this program has 3 months within Climate Drift as well. We're doing deep dives on a lot of the things that we talked about briefly today. Each week is devoted to a different theme, and it's very community focused because, like we wanted to focus in this workshop today, this can be tough work, and it's helpful to do it in community. Be inspired by what other people are trying. So I'm happy to answer questions you have about this program after the fact in Slack, however you want to bring those to me. But I just wanted to be sure that you knew anyone who mentions work on climate when they apply to this program gets an automatic 30% off, and that lowers the cost of the 6-week program to $647. So, happy to talk more about this, but not going to spend a whole lot of time on it right now because we want to leave time for any additional questions coming up. But know that this is available if you want to keep going and connect to another community to dive deeper on what you started today. And we also have a QR code so you can offer feedback on this workshop today. So yeah, Steph, did you want to say more about this slide? You might know more about
Yeah,
this.
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining our session and wanted to invite you to take a couple of minutes before you go to give us some live feedback. We appreciate this so that we can share anything we need to know about how we can improve our events and also any feedback you have for Katie about her content. She's very open and welcoming of that. So please give us a little shout out there about your thoughts and how this went for you. If you're not yet part of Work on Climate, please check out the link that Nicolette is putting in the chat there, and you can learn more about Katie at both her website and also her LinkedIn channel. And those those links are in the chat there. Um, and if you have any questions, we have a few moments before the end of the session. So feel free to pop them in chat or unmute yourself and check in with Katie here. We welcome whatever input or questions you might have.
I see a question from Alex here in the chat, which is a really good one. Can you say something about formats? I find the most paralyzing thing is not knowing the format to work to. And Alex, if you'd like, I'm happy to talk about it with you in conversation, or I can speak to this. So feel free to unmute yourself and chime in if you want to chat back and forth. And one thing I saw you also had said that writing is not your favorite thing, and I totally understand the decision paralysis that someone else mentioned as well. So I wonder again if one way to think about thought leadership is we're not just trying to, I know everyone in this room understands this. It's not about picking up a megaphone and shouting, right? One thing we really focus on in thought leadership for humans is talking about thinking specifically who you want to be talking to and what that value exchange looks like, which might sound very business-like, but I think there's something that's a very regenerative economy concept. We have things to share with one another. If I have knowledge that's helpful to share with you, there might be another way that you being in community with me is helpful to me. So, Alex, I wonder if even before you're thinking about formats, you're thinking about who you want to be connecting with. And maybe that looks like sending individual emails to people. That was the focus for some people who are getting started in the program. They wanted to find specific ways. For example, there's one specific woman who works in international development, bringing more clean energy solutions to some of the poorest parts of the world. And she really wanted some of her colleagues to be thinking more about climate in international development when she felt like that was an underserved topic. And so, what she realized she needed to do was think specifically about the people she wanted to reach and reach out to them one on one. For her, it wasn't about finding the right format for a LinkedIn post. It was for her a little bit less intimidating than that. It was about starting conversations. And then that can roll into maybe convening an event or even a closed Zoom meeting of people who need to be talking to each other. I think this is maybe less about the megaphone, and for some of us, particularly more about building a network, building a community within which we're having a specific conversation. I hope that's helpful. And Kristen, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi. I guess mine is kind of along the lines of the format. So I write a weekly newsletter and then I write essays that tend to be longer form. And I'm like, recently I've made the step to begin posting about these things on LinkedIn. And what I'm finding kind of annoying is adapting them for LinkedIn. And so it's like, I don't want to spend all this extra time like rewriting something. So I guess I'm wondering, you talked a lot about like posting on LinkedIn is the number one. So it's like, is the general rule like you're sort of writing for that LinkedIn post and like what are best practices around adapting what you're writing elsewhere for LinkedIn?
Yeah, that's a great question because this is a really powerful engine for some people to get started. Kristen, I also prefer long form, so I feel like LinkedIn is not my platform, but I use it for what it's good for. I love an email newsletter and getting into the essay. Write the essay the way the essay wants to be written. At that point, I would not recommend writing with LinkedIn in mind. Once you have that newsletter written, LinkedIn becomes your distribution network. That's simply a way to help more people find your newsletter, but that's your source of truth. That's you're trying to point people there. And I understand it is an additional step, but I would say let that LinkedIn post be rather short and that could follow a specific format. I've seen people say things like, I just spent 6 hours doing a deep dive into everything I know about X, and you can find it over on my newsletter. New drop yesterday. Here's a link to it or subscribe here. It really can be that simple if you're just thinking of it as a, a pointer finger heading over to the place where the real goods live. Takes the pressure off.
Yeah, true. Thank you.
That was really helpful. Thank you so much, Katie. I think we're going to wrap it up here for today, and we can keep the conversation going over on Work on Climate Slack. Thank you
Please.
so much, everyone who showed up. Thank you so
Yes.
much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Keep talking.
Okay, bye.
Bye.